9. Introduction. The story of this book began at a lecture I gave on the Trump-Netanyahu deal, known as the deal of the century. The lecture had been turned into an Arabic booklet that met with a wide and enthusiastic reception, and many encouraged me to then publish it in English. But once it was translated and ready to go to press, I realized it needed some historical background and analysis. Its edition gradually expanded to include my thoughts on the Palestine question and a summary of my conclusions from studies and essays I published on this subject in Arabic, Hebrew, and English over the past 3 decades. The result is the present volume, in which the lecture occupies just 1 chapter. Although I wrote the above-mentioned studies as an academic, I am not a specialist in the sense that innumerable scholars of the history of Palestine, Zionism, and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and on whose publications I draw. I approach the Palestine issue as a researcher and scholar, but at the same time as someone to whom this subject is very personal and who has lived with it on a daily basis for years. Palestine is my homeland. However, Israel is not an abstract other for me. I am as familiar with its social, cultural, and political life as I am with that of Palestine. When writing on this question, I bring to bear the greatest possible critical and scientific objectivity, though not necessarily neutrality. You can refer to Israel's control over the West Bank and Jerusalem as an occupation, which is an objective descriptive, but not a neutral one in the eyes of many. Similarly, you can objectively view the Zionist project in Palestine as primarily a form of settler colonialism, but this is not neutral either. Objectivity concerns using scientific method and available facts. It is also a conscious effort to avoid cherry-picking and laying value judgments and ideological stances in nuanced reasoning processes. If objectivity appears biased to some, it is simply because it is predisposed to truth-seeking. Neutrality, on the other hand, is a belief and attitude and not a scientific method. It is a negative moral position of no bias and no alignment, and a moral position. When it comes to an issue of oppression or a consummately humanitarian issue, an immoral position could become an immoral one. I am not neutral towards anything to do with the Palestine question or any other just cause. It is no coincidence that this book opens with the Nakba, calamity, catastrophe, not just to establish historical context but also to determine the subject. 10. Itself. Nakba, or Palestinian catastrophe, is the term used to refer to the Palestinians' loss of their homeland upon the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Chapter 1 discusses this major event, its impact, its various dimensions, and the assorted myths that have grown around it. It also discusses its meaning, its ramifications, connotations, and symbolic significance. However, my particular concern is to show that the Palestinian cause did not begin in 1967, and that it is not simply about the occupied Gaza Strip and West Bank, despite the current importance of these 2 chunks of territory as components of the Palestinian cause and their centrality in the international political approach to this question. The most important reason why I open with the Nakba is that this book, as a whole, is an attempt to show that the question of Palestine is not simply a dilemma awaiting creative policy solutions, but rather a question of injustice that can only be resolved through the application of justice. Justice can take various forms, all of them relative. None of them, however, should involve bargaining with the Palestinians over sovereignty over the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, as though the problem of Palestine could be resolved by further Palestinian concessions on the territories that, in all events, constitute just 22% of historic Palestine. As I see it, justice, when applied to the Palestinian question, is primarily founded on a historically showing equilibrium between the 2 chief components of justice, equality and freedom. Where the Palestinians as a people are concerned, freedom entails their liberation from occupation and from their status as an occupied people stripped of fundamental rights and as refugees. Equality between the two peoples in the area between Jordan and the Mediterranean can take one of two forms. One is full and equal citizenship within the framework of a single state, either equality in terms of citizenship within a single state based on mutual recognition of each people's identity and communal rights, and on guarantees for equality in the individual rights of both peoples as citizens of this state. The other is equality between them in the framework of two separate and sovereign states, neither subordinate to the other and each one a state of its citizens, although one has a predominantly Jewish and the other a predominantly Arab character. In the case of Palestine, political programs, and probably solutions, must also be found to second-order problems that grew out of the principal issue. What is essential, in all cases, is to bear in mind the heart of the matter that the question began with. 11. Settler colonialism entailing occupation, expropriation, ethnic cleansing and the forced displacement of the native population to pave the way for the establishment of a Jewish state and for the transformation of the Jewish minority in Palestine to a Jewish majority. Historical memory is fashioned by the same institutions that shape identity, regimes, myths, historiography, ceremonies, choices of dates and places to commemorate, literature and textbooks that try to pass off manufacturing a collective consciousness. A convergence of diverse interests also plays a part, with some asserting a more dominant nuance than others. History is written by the victors, the old adage goes. Certainly, this was true in the past when the victor monopolized the tools of writing history and producing myths. In some cases, collective memory of the oppressed survived to create counter-myths that challenged and subverted official history and their dominant collective memory, but only in exceptional cases was the history written from their perspective. In the contemporary world, writing history and forging collective memory are no longer the preserve of the powerful. Even so, new challenges have nonetheless emerged, like disparities in the access to public spaces and the pluralization of the production and dissemination of information on the internet, which levels the status between fact and fiction, and truth and lies. It remains, of course, the question of ideology, which has always been a modern challenge. However, the end of the Cold War ushered in a new phenomenon, the decline of totalizing ideologies and the collapse of the great 20th century ideologies in favor of the eclectic ideologies of power politics, identity politics and populism. Simultaneously, however, there has been a rise in moral approaches to life. More and more young people in today's world broach social and political issues from a moral perspective that may be infused with identitarian perspectives, especially in issues involving human dignity rather than an ideological perspective. Young people from different backgrounds and ways of life, e.g., religious or secular, liberal or laist or with no dominative worldview, protest together against what they consider unjust. It has opened up new opportunities for the oppressed everywhere. We can easily observe this and even document the resemblance between the poignant scenes and discourses of such movements as the Youth Solidarity campaigns with Palestine in May 2021, the Black Lives Matter (BLM) movements, the 2019 uprisings of the young generation in Lebanon and Iraq against 12. Sectarianism, corruption and armed militias, not to mention the opening phases of the Arab revolutions in 2011. Its historical ethical turn is great news for the struggle for justice. It is to be observed in issues such as the environment, gender and social justice. But here is the place to parenthetically remark that its aversion to politics can also be coupled with skepticism towards political rational considerations of historical social contexts. His approach may magnify its potential to oppose injustices but limits its capability to present alternatives and renders it susceptible to new sorts of populism, such as what one might call elitist populism, which may appear oxymoronic for now. When I began preparing this book for publication, it looked as though the Palestinian cause had been thoroughly marginalized. Numerous Arab states were rushing to normalize relations with Israel, arguing that the centrality of the Palestinian cause was a myth and, therefore, not a real priority for Arab states. EY were encouraged in this by individuals in the former Trump administration whose pro-Israeli bias was so blind and unconditional that they parroted the positions of the Israeli far-right. However, these individuals had conveniently overlooked a number of hard facts, the most salient of which is that the Palestinian people live under a brutal and relentless occupation. It is precisely because individual Palestinians have to endure the perpetual strains and constantly looming cruelties of this reality on a day-to-day basis that their cause is not going to disappear, regardless of the motives of some Arab regimes, whose agendas take no account of their own people's interests, much less those of the Palestinians. On the other hand, the regional attempts to marginalize the Palestinian cause only to emphasize the national connectual aspect of it for the benefit of more emphasis on the democratic struggle for justice in Palestine itself and its interaction with the struggle for democracy and justice in the Arab countries. And internationally, successive generations of Palestinians have inherited their ongoing cause. For Arab peoples, in general, the importance of this cause stems not just from the fact that it is an Arab cause, but also, and more crucially, from its relation to the still ongoing phenomenon of settler colonialism. As such, the symbolism of injustice in general, and resistance to it, is all the more intensely ed by the Palestinian plight. Anyone who thinks that Arab public opinion, expressions of which on the Palestinian question are presented in an appendix, has Leela 13. Impact or can be disregarded need only consider the grassroots uprisings in the Arab region in 2011 and, again, in 2019. Whoever thinks that popular opinion is unimportant, or even disregards its existence, should give some thought to the popular uprisings of 2011 and the second wave of 2019. In light of the foregoing, we should not be surprised that the chain of interrelated events that began in May 2021, the outbreak and spread of waves of mass protests in solidarity with families threatened with expulsion from their homes in Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan and other Jerusalem neighborhoods to make way for Jewish settlers, the simultaneous protests in defense of the Aqsa Mosque against recurrent incursions by Jewish settlers and the Israeli army, Hamas's claim to expand its concept of deterrence to encompass Israeli abuses in Jerusalem, and the renewed Arab of the war in Gaza put paid to all the allegations and hype surrounding their deal of the century. Similarly, these developments burst the bubble of the myth promoted by the far-right circles surrounding former President Donald Trump that held that the US could move its embassy to Jerusalem in an attempt to legitimize Israel's unilateral annexation of the city in violation of international law without risking any repercussions. No analysis of the recent uprising in Jerusalem, which began as the now touches were being placed on this book, is possible without recognizing the impact of Washington's decision to proceed with moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in blatant disregard of Palestinian and Arab feelings. The same applies to the rush on the part of some Arab states to normalize relations or form bilateral alliances with Israel in order to forestall a repetition of what they consider America's abandonment of its allies during the popular Arab revolutions and uprisings of 2011 to 2. Let us recall here that the alliances between some Gulf states and Israel ostensibly concluded to preserve regional stability are not as recent as they appear. Strangely enough, alliances preceded the normalization of relations. EY were forged immediately after the uprisings of 2011, and before that in some cases. Their purpose was to avert the democratic transformation in the Arab region. is coincided with the Israeli leadership's concept of security, according to which democratization in the Arab world would pose an existential threat to Israel. It is not to deny the existence of other common interests and concerns, most notably the shared fear of Iran. Indeed, Iranian policies trigger alarm not only among authoritarian Arab regimes, but also among democrats and abroad. 14. Sectors of Arab societies due to Tehran's divisive exploitation of sectarian issues and propaganda. It is not to mention its staunch support of the regime in Syria and of sectarian militias in several Arab countries. But this is another matter. The Palestinian cause is the world's last remaining unresolved instance of settler colonialism. Numerous other instances of this phenomenon have either ended over the course of history or normalized, bequeathing residual unsolved issues and grievances among indigenous peoples. Israeli leaders are banking on this latter outcome, that the Palestinian cause will fade into oblivion while Israel maintains the status quo of a state of peace with Arab regimes willing and able to oppose the popular sentiment on this issue. In most historical cases, settlers have built nations atop the ruins of the cultures and civilizations of other peoples who had inhabited the land for thousands of years, turning them into indigenous peoples whose struggle, at least in democratic countries, is limited to pressing demands for reparations, cultural rights and the like. It does not seem to be the case in Palestine, where settler colonialism cannot nativize or indigenize, as it maintains an apartheid regime. On the other hand, the fate of the colonialist settler project in Palestine is bound to differ from, for example, that of the French project in Algeria, for example, where French settlers had the option to return to their own motherland. There is no motherland for the present-day generations of Israeli Jews other than Israel itself. A settler colonial project that began in the 20th century would inevitably unfold in ways totally unlike its predecessors from the 18th to the 19th century. It was, after all, the era of the rise and culmination of Third World anti-colonialist and national independence movements. But this is not the main reason why settler colonialism in Palestine cannot be normalized. And why the settlers, in this case, cannot be nativized or naturalized. There are two crucial historical factors that prevent this in the absence of a just solution to the Palestinian cause. First is that as a result of Israel's rejection of the division of Palestine into two states as set forth in the 1947 United Nations Partition Resolution, a resolution the Zionist movement recognized only in order to declare a Jewish state, this colonialist settler venture eventually acquired an apartheid character, especially after Israel reunited the whole of historic Palestine under its rule with its territorial conquests in the 1967 war. A military occupation regime that Israel instituted gradually evolved into a 15. System of ethnic segregation, whereby two peoples living under the same authority and, relatively speaking, in the framework of the same economic system are subject to two entirely different legal systems. Under this binary, civil and human rights are manifestly different for the occupiers and occupied. Israeli settler colonialism will never be naturalized, no matter how much time passes, unless it recognizes the historic injustice that it has perpetrated against the Palestinian people and acts to redress it. Half of those currently living in historical Palestine are Arabs and half of them are Jews. All of them live under a government that adopts the Jewishness of the State of Israel as a supreme value, uses its monopoly on violence to ensure religio-ethnic superiority of one ethnic group over the other, and embraces a nationalist ideology with a religious stamp. In short, in addition to the different historical contexts, the evolution of the Zionist Southeast-ler drive differs from settler drives that founded other countries. Israel did not evolve into a state for all its citizens. It insists on remaining a state fundamentally based on religio-ethnic domination or dedicated to the dominance of a particular ethno-religious affiliation. A second factor is that by the time a Zionist settler entity established a presence in Palestine, the Palestinians were already in possession of a national consciousness and national aspirations. EY simultaneously saw themselves as part of a broader Arab community, an imagined community, to be more accurate. EY had thus developed a sense of national identity long before the colonialist settler movement was powerful enough to subject them to a process of sociocide and or politicide. Still, despite all attempts to obliterate them as a political and social entity, they have survived as a people aspiring to reclaim their legitimate rights and see their national demands met. At the same time, an Israeli Jewish people has emerged in Israel. In this case, of course, the sense of a Jewish national identity originated in the Zionist movement. However, this movement could not have succeeded in creating a nation had it not been for the establishment of the State of Israel. Is emergent state, regardless of its illegitimacy in the eyes of most inhabitants of Palestine and the Arab world at the time, proceeded to establish national institutions, build a sophisticated and integrated economy, revive Hebrew as a spoken language, enforce mandatory conscription into a modern army, and weave and market a founding narrative that successfully exploited their 16. Historical circumstances of the times. It was such concrete factors that created an Israeli Jewish people with a claim to both individual and communal rights. There can be no absolute justice in a situation of this sort, because absolute justice means turning back the clock. A type of justice required here is the eventual achievement of legal and political equality between the two peoples in Palestine in the present day. I would add a third major obstacle to the naturalization of Israeli settler colonialism, a regional environment in which Israel is regarded with suspicion and hostility, which, in turn, is a source of Israeli fear and antagonism towards Arab peoples' aspirations to liberate themselves from authoritarianism. Is deep-seated mutual hostility is both an expression of Israel's alienation from its regional environment and a source of the reproduction of the Arab grassroots rejection of Israel. As will be discussed in chapters 2 and 3, what has further complicated their Palestine issue and obstructed Palestinian liberation is its overlap between what I term their Arab question, one and the issue referred to in Europe since the 19th century as their Jewish question. A particular position of Palestine at the intersection of these two questions has both complicated and aggravated the intractability of the Palestine question. His book will detail the dimensions of the complexity in conjunction with questions of memory and forging. Chapters 4 through 6 will discuss the origin of the Arab-Israeli Colonialism, a colonialism that began at a time when no Arab lands were under occupation except for Palestine, and proceed to discuss the significance of the bilateral or separate processes between certain Arab states and Israel. These chapters will also trace the course of the Palestinian national liberation movement from its formative phase through the period of armed struggle and then to its succumbing to the trap of making peace with Israel in a manner that left all core issues unresolved. Palestinians gained nothing in return but Israel's recognition of the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO. And that only came after the movement turned the question issue of Palestine from the unifying Arab cause par excellence into an exclusively Israeli-Palestinian concept. The upshot of this evolution was the creation of a Palestinian authority that possessed neither sovereignty nor a state. Needless to say, this did not resolve the Palestinian question. Instead, it freed Israel from the daily burdens of managing the occupation directly thanks to the introduction of a system of 17. Security coordination between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, PA. 2. It also marginalized the PLO and triggered a struggle for power in Palestine long before a Palestinian state was even within reach. A current intra-Palestinian RI can only be understood in the context of the decision to abandon the Palestinian national liberation struggle and settle for an authority operating under occupation without an ounce of sovereignty. A second part of the book begins with an analytical reading of the Trump-Netanyahu deal in 2020. His deal may have faded from the political scene despite the din it stirred during the Trump administration. However, it is important to spend some time on it for three reasons. First, the Israeli Prime Minister who replaced Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett, still thinks in the same terms of the so-called deal, economic incentives instead of justice. Second, Arab states were lured into blaming the victim, the Palestinian people, to justify the alliances they made with Israel, partly in order to strengthen their bilateral alliances with the US. There is a long tradition of this type of strategic thinking. It stretches back to the Nakba and involves trading on the Palestinian cause as a means to gain some leverage in the context of diplomatic relations with Western powers. A third reason has to do with the embrace of the nationalist rhetoric of religious Zionism by certain circles in the former Trump administration. It applies in particular to the individuals who arose and acquired influence through the alliance between Zionism and extremist American evangelical churches. These individuals were sometimes more zealous in their advocacy of the ideas and attitudes of religious Zionist rhetoric than the Israeli religious right itself. The official US document laying out Trump's deal of the century offers an opportunity to identify the inherent fallacies in this discourse. The last two chapters are devoted to a discussion of what is to be done in the future and the extent to which this question is related to an analysis of the nature of the currently existing regime in Palestine. In this context, I will address the terms settler colonialism and apartheid. Both can be used as concepts to analyze and gain a clearer understanding of the present-day reality. But surely the choice of a political program is contingent on more than analytical models. Should the collective struggle focus on the GHT against apartheid and the GHT for equal rights in a single state? Or should it aim for the establishment of a separate, democratic and sovereign Palestinian state in 18. The West Bank and Gaza? Ultimately, the task is not theoretical and abstract, but practical and quintessentially strategic. Perhaps another way we could look at this is to ask, should the nature of the existing system of power and control in Palestine be the primary determinant of whether to pursue their one-state or their two-state solution? Obviously, settler colonialism and the current system of segregation under Israeli rule and apartheid are not mutually exclusive. The colonizers of South Africa did not bring a blueprint for apartheid with them. The system evolved out of a settler colonial regime. The same applies to the apartheid-like system in Palestine. In my view, an analysis and discussion of that system may be helpful to determine the forms of resistance that should, though not necessarily will, be adopted, but it is not critical to determining the choice of the solution or political program. Moreover, the outcome of negotiated solutions, regardless of the choice, have less to do with the structure of their system of control than with the forms, efficacy and tenacity of the resistance, the actions and relative weight of the political actors set on imposing unacceptable conditions, the nature of the international order, the geostrategic situation, and other such concrete factors. In the last chapter, I discuss ideas related to the strategies of Palestinian struggle, my view being that no academic study can propose a purely theoretical strategy of resistance. All resistance strategies do not operate in the abstract, they connect directly with the human actors and concrete circumstances in a specific place and time. In sum, this book consists of two parts. ERST, and longest, is a reading of and reaction on history. I ask for the reader's indulgence here because this part is written in essay form and addresses a number of ideas I believe are essential to a thorough grasp of the history. It thus eschews the chronological unfolding and detailed discussion of historical events that readers might normally expect. Some historical background and details are a must for the proper understanding of the ideas I present, but in order not to contentiously interrupt the flow of the text, I have provided the necessary background in the form of footnotes, long footnotes in some cases. Each should be treated as a parallel text to be read in conjunction with the main text. A second part consists of 3 chapters addressing the Trump-Netanyahu deal, the concepts question of settler colonialism and apartheid, and the question as to what comes next. 19. His book does not, and cannot, cover all aspects of the Palestinian cause. It is a condensation of decades of personal experience, readings, reactions and writings on the issue. Acknowledgement: in the task of bringing this book to a rapid conclusion, I was assisted by a team of researchers and assistants who prepared lists of relevant literature and who reviewed and commented on the text. Hence, I would like to take this occasion to thank Mohammed Al-Mashri, Ayat Hamdan, Dana El-Kurd and Hani Awad of the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, ACRPS, as well as my assistant Isra Batainer. I would also like to thank Farah Horaner, Peter Daniel, Mandy McClure and Abby Lewis who helped in editing different versions of the text. 1. Azmi Bishra, on the Arab Question, An Introduction to an Arab Democratic Manifesto, Arabic, Beirut, Center for Arab Unity Studies, 2007. 2. It is officially known as the Palestinian National Authority, PNA.